If you'd asked me a few years ago on this topic, I would have said trans men are men, trans women are women, some people are trans, get over it, let's move on. This is all blown out of proportion.
Do you regret?
I think I absolutely take the criticism on the chin.
Welcome to Never Mind The Ballots, the politics show that everyone's talking about, with me, Harry Cole, and my team from The Sun. The NHS needs major surgery and more money is not the answer. That's not the words of a Tory minister, but Labour's Shadow Health Secretary. In a fiery piece for Monday's Sun, Wes Streeting warned the NHS is a service, not a shrine. And many on the left are raging. Well, the man himself is here to fight back today. Wes Streeting, welcome to Never Mind The Ballots.
Thank you for having me.
We've asked our readers for lots of questions, and questions came. Our first one comes from a reader called Bertie, who was actually a bit of a star of the show last week with a brilliant question for the Prime Minister. Bertie asks you, he says, you've railed against middle-class lefties. You've argued that more private involvement in the NHS might be helpful and that left-wing principles should not trump access to care. Do you sometimes wonder you're in the wrong party?
No, I'm always in the right party. I mean, there have been times, I must admit, when Jeremy Corbyn was leader, where I found myself pulling my hair out of the state of the Labour Party, and so did many Labour voters. But look, I'm on the centre-left. I always have been. And actually, the argument I made in your paper this week wasn't just a pragmatic argument, which is we've got record high waiting lists, we want to get them down, there's private sector capacity that's there to be used. It was a principled argument because one of the consequences of the last 14 years of Tory mismanagement of the NHS is we've got a two-tier system now. And those who can afford it are paying to go private, being diagnosed earlier, treated faster, better for them, better for outcomes. And working class people who can't afford it are being left behind. And I don't think that's fair. And that's why I've said that a Labour government will work constructively with the private sector to get those NHS waiting lists down, honouring that NHS principle that when you seek healthcare, you'll never have to worry about the bill.
Were you trying to be provocative to try and sort of wake your party up to this fact? Or what's the, you calling people middle-class lefties and howls of outrage, that seems deliberate to me.
Well, I think the Labour Party's already in the right place. And just as at the last Labour conference, Rachel Reeves got a standing ovation for talking about the importance of treating taxpayers' money with respect and spending it wisely, I got a standing ovation on NHS reform in a way that a lot of people would have thought, well, the Labour Party's never going to go for that. And that's because, look, people do love the NHS. It is an institution our country cares about, and we've all got stories about the NHS and the difference it's made. I mean, in my case, it literally saved my life a few years ago when I went through kidney cancer. But it's in defence of those founding principles of the NHS that we make the argument for reform, that unless it modernises, it's not going to be there for us. And I don't want a future in this country where people fall ill and one of the things they have to worry about is the bill. I'm never going to let that happen, but that means the NHS does need to reform and change.
People have tried to reform the NHS before, lots of people. You said in the piece, the public don't trust the Tories, so they don't dare change it. Only Labour can change the NHS. Well, on what basis is that true?
You know, there are Tory ministers who said, oh, look, we need to reform the NHS, but the problem is it will be career suicide if we try and do that. And I think that's because people don't trust the Tories with the NHS. We saw that massive top-down reorganisation under Andrew Lansley. It's been catastrophic for the NHS. Whereas, look, people know that the Labour Party is committed to the NHS and its principles. Beyond those middle-class lefties railing online that I mentioned the other day,
we'll come back to those in a minute,
accusing me of wanting to privatise the NHS. I mean, over my dead body will we privatise the NHS. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't reform, we shouldn't change. In fact, just this week, I was up in Manchester with Rachel Reeves talking to frontline clinicians who are modernising the way they do their service. Like, it's not, there's this idea that it's sort of me versus the health staff. Actually, loads of staff in the NHS, like patients, can see that it's not working, and just chucking more money at the system isn't going to solve the problem. You need to reform the way it works.
Lots of people agree with that, but this idea that only Labour can be the ones that do it, we'll get into that. We'll get into that in a moment. But first of all, I just want to read you what some of our readers have said. These are direct quotes. Angie says, how can Labour say they'll be good with the NHS when Welsh NHS has collapsed on their watch? It's worse than England's. Denzel in Wales says, interesting to hear Wes say that the NHS is a service, not a shrine. Over the past 25 years of Labour mismanagement in Wales, they've turned it from a service to a shambles. The Tories say that people are twice as likely to be waiting for treatment under NHS Labour-run Wales than in England. You know, what's this idea? Labour in practice doesn't match your noble rhetoric.
Well, look, the Welsh Labour government wouldn't pretend that the NHS is working brilliantly in Wales at the moment. In fact, right across the UK, the NHS is in crisis. I asked people to judge Labour on our record when we were last in government, which delivered the shortest waiting times and the highest patient satisfaction ever. And I think what you need, because it is a national health service, yes, it's devolved, but it is a national health service, and you do see lots of cross-border working. The funding in Westminster affects funding in Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. The reform agenda that I'm setting out will create a rising tide that will lift all ships in every part of the country.
You can see why people are worried, though, when Keir Starmer says Labour in Wales is a blueprint for a Labour government, and the stats are pretty shocking.
Well, I've no doubt that if there is a Labour government, we will create a rising tide that will lift all ships across the NHS in every part of the UK. And I'm committed to working constructively with health ministers in every part of the UK, whoever's in government.
Talking of working constructively, do you think Labour have a share of the blame for the toxic debate around the NHS and the fact that only Labour can touch the NHS? Because every time anyone else has ever tried to touch the NHS, you've screamed 24 hours to save the NHS. Every election so far has been, this is the election, the NHS is in the people's hands, only Labour can save it. You sort of slightly poison the well for anyone else who agrees with you.
No, look, I think that ultimately we've been right to say that you can't trust the Tories with the NHS. When we left office...
But you told them they were going to, last election, you said they were going to sell it to Donald Trump. It was nonsense.
Well, when we left office in 2010, we had the shortest waiting times and the highest patient satisfaction on record. And 14 years later, we see the exact opposite. So I think one of the many reasons why Rishi Sunak is a busted flush is that under every shade of Conservative Prime Minister, and there have been plenty to judge them on now over the last 14 years, the NHS has got worse and worse. And of course, things like the pandemic have had an impact. Of course that's true. But the NHS waiting lists were at record levels before the pandemic.
Pre-pandemic.
And the problems were stored up before the pandemic, which has made the situation now even more challenging.
But people pre-pandemic, Matt Hancock, Lord Bethell, health ministers were saying technology, workforce reform and prevention were the key things to getting, the NHS fixed. That's pretty much your plan as well, isn't it?
But they didn't deliver.
Well, they had a pandemic that wiped them out. Isn't there more consensus than you kind of give them
deliver.
credit?
Well, look, I think as a general rule, the more consensus you can establish so that you don't see, the country kind of veering about like a shopping trolley, depending on who's in government, the more consensus you can establish for the right reform, the better. But I just say to people that at the next election, I do think the NHS is on the ballot paper. And
so 24 hours to save the NHS again,
I genuinely think if you have 5 more years of Conservative government, what we've seen in NHS dentistry will be the future for the whole NHS, which is the NHS is a poor service for poor people while everyone else goes private. And I don't think that's the future.
No mainstream political party at that election will be calling for an end of healthcare free at the point of entry. No.
I think you're right about that. But what you see with the Tories is the long, slow decline of the NHS.
Surely then it's fair to have a proper debate. If everyone agrees healthcare free at the point of entry is a good thing, which they do, why then not have a proper debate about how that's delivered?
We're leading that debate, and the Tories
well, you said that you're going to work with the private sector to get waiting lists down by expanding capacity. Does it stop there? Is there more room for the private sector in your NHS?
Well, there's definitely lots of space for reform and modernisation. If you look at Labour's plans to cut waiting lists, for example, as well as working with the private sector, we want to make sure that the NHS is providing 2 million more appointments a year, evenings and weekends. We've allocated £1.1 billion to do that. That's money going into the pockets of NHS staff. But it's also requiring them to work differently through those extra clinics in the evenings and at weekends when some of those operating theatres would otherwise be left empty. If you look at what we're doing on diagnostic scanners, it's not just doubling them, more scanners, it's AI-enabled scanners, so we're using the latest technology to modernise the way the service operates. And on data, for example, we want to make sure that the data revolution that we see means that whether it's in general practice or in hospitals, that we are putting the NHS at the cutting edge of innovation so that we can give people a more personalised service and also put the UK at the forefront of breakthroughs in medical science and research.
We're going to talk about your details in your plans in detail with our own Sun Health Secretary shortly. But just quickly, you've upset the middle-class lefties with your piece. The newsagents, I'd say probably the union of middle-class lefties, the podcast, they've said you're using the language of Suella Braverman. What do you say to that?
Oh, I just thought they were totally ridiculous. But I'll tell you, I've had loads of grief. I'll tell you for me what it's all about. I got an email the other day from a guy called Dave about his mum's care. And this is what he said. I won't read the whole email. It was a long email and a really moving WhatsApp exchange between Dave and his mum. He said, "No doubt you're being inundated with abuse, indignation and all sorts of grief from those who have no idea what you're talking about. So I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for representing my mum and those who like her. hard-working folks with 18 plus months on the waiting list for a new knee, unable to effectively move around her own home, who is lucky enough to be benefiting from the NHS using, and he mentions a private provider, to reduce her waiting time. It means so much to her and all the family as we can't afford to jump the queue. I'm in it for people like Dave, and frankly, making sure that Dave's mum can get timely access to care is more important than people's ideological hobby horse. And what I'd say to my critics online, including those people who regularly take to Twitter as keyboard warriors, you have to look people like Dave's mum in the eye and tell her that your left-wing principles are more important than her getting timely access to care. And my left-wing principles say that working-class people should not be left behind, while middle and upper-class people can afford to jump the queue.
And I have to say, we had a lot of emails like that, which hopefully we'll be able to get to later on a similar theme, saying that reality on the ground is far more important than getting claps from the unions. We've got to move on. Obviously, another big story today, the Cass review. No good use for puberty blockers, remarkable weak evidence, thousands of lives ruined, essentially, by evidence built on sand, experts cowed by the mob of people accusing them of being transphobic. How did it take this long to get to this scenario?
Yeah, look, first of all, I welcome the Cass review, and I want to thank Hilary Cass and her team for the thorough and thoughtful and careful and sensitive way in which they've undertaken this research in an area that, when you look at the children and young people involved, and actually, the adults in our country as well, who are, I think, desperately worried and frightened about the toxicity of this debate, I think she's done a really important piece of work, but I think it does raise some serious concerns that are pretty scandalous, actually. I think we've got to ask ourselves, why is it that we've seen medical interventions that have been given on the basis of very weak evidence? Yeah. How is it that clinicians have been silenced or afraid to come forward? Why is it that a group of young people who are extremely vulnerable are waiting years to access treatment? And I think there's plenty of blame to go around. I'm pretty angry, actually, that despite this review having been commissioned, there are some NHS trusts that refuse to cooperate. Yeah. And I want to send a clear message to them that under a Labour government, there will be accountability for that. You're not going to get away with it. And I want to work constructively with the government to make sure we get this right.
We're back to the consensus on that. So under a Labour government, none of this nonsense is coming back. None of this, evidence-free.
No, we're going to take an evidence-led approach to this. And look, I think that at the heart of this, we've got, and at the heart of this complexity, I think Dr. Cass points out, Hannah Barnes, who's done a brilliant book, Time to Think. Two things are true simultaneously. There are trans adults in this country who've undergone life-changing gender reassignment surgery who say that for all the pain and difficulty that involved, it wasn't just life-affirming, it was life-changing. And there are also adults in this country who've undergone gender reassignment who say it was a disaster, it's ruined their lives, it's irreversible now in terms of the consequences, and they ask, how did anyone let this happen? And that's why we've got to get this right, and we've got to proceed on the basis of evidence.
A debate around this issue has been utterly poisonous. People trying to blow the whistle on this were unable to get their books published, even get picked up on in mainstream debate. Groups like Stonewall, for example, have been vicious to anyone that's criticised things like this over the last decade or so. Do you regret working with a group like that? You worked for them for a while.
Well, when I worked for Stonewall, we didn't do gender identity. This is a kind of more new development. Do you think they got it wrong, though? I definitely think in terms of the approach, like Stonewall traditionally has had some grief sometimes because for being too establishment and working across the political divide. I mean, on equal marriage, for example, Stonewall was sat in the room with bishops who were opposed to it, with peers
but on
and MPs.
On this issue, have they got it wrong?
On this, I think they haven't been open enough to the argument and to the discussion.
They ran a campaign saying trans women are women, get over it. Do you agree with that?
No, to the extent that, look, and I say this with some self-criticism and reflection, if you'd asked me a few years ago on this topic, I would have said, trans men are men, trans women are women, some people are trans, get over it, let's move on, this is all blown out of proportion. And now I sort of sit and reflect and think, actually, there are lots of complexities and challenges.
Isn't that the problem, that leading
debate.
figures like yourself, and I'm not just singling you out, but leading figures like yourself were saying, get over it,
no,
when people were trying to raise the facts. So you regret?
I think I absolutely take the criticism on the chin. And at the same time, I also think that there's been some absolutely ugly rhetoric directed towards trans people who are at the wrong end of all of the statistics on hate crime, on self-harm, suicide, mental ill health. So I think we've got a collective responsibility to be open to this debate and discussion, and to do so in the sort of thoughtful, careful and sensitive way that Dr. Cass has.
Hopefully a
And I hope that's
a debate that we should have
to.
had perhaps a decade ago. Let's powerful words there. Thank you, Wes. Just another story that's doing the rounds. I'm going to ask you very briefly about this. Angela Rayner, your mate. She's obviously refusing to publish any details about her sort of, tax affairs, personal affairs, saying she's answered all the questions, yet the questions keep mounting. Now, on a very specific point, Rachel Reeves yesterday said that Angela Rayner shouldn't be singled out as an MP because she's just an MP rather than the Chancellor or the Prime Minister, so she shouldn't have to publish any of her details. But on the 26th of April 2020, Angela Rayner wrote to the Conservative Party demanding that a candidate, not even an MP, a candidate, Jill Mortimer, in the by-election that year, should publish her tax returns and come clean. Exactly the same thing she's saying she shouldn't have to do. That's hypocrisy, isn't it?
Well, I definitely think that in terms of publishing tax returns...
Well, not even tax returns, just explaining the clear reasons why she thinks that she doesn't have questions to answer when there are mounting questions.
Well, there's a general principle and then there's a specific. I think actually we've got to be a bit careful about entering into a world in which everyone publishes all of their tax returns.
So Angela Rayner was wrong to demand...
Well, sometimes there will be good reasons why.
Is this not a good reason why?
Sometimes there'll be good reasons.
But is this a good reason?
In terms of Angela's case, look, she has answered questions.
She hasn't, though. She doesn't answer. We phone up her office all the time and ask detailed questions, and she says her spokesman says she won't be answering.
Well, I think the important thing is that Angela, like everyone else in this country, she files her tax returns to HMRC. They look at tax returns and they decide whether we've paid enough tax or not. I think it's no secret that Angela's life has been more complicated than most people's. And to be honest, I couldn't give a monkeys about Angela's tax return and what her living arrangements were with her husband more than 10 years ago.
It's relatively minor. It is a relatively minor issue, but I think the problem is the statement she released when this story first broke is actually what's given legs to the story, because she said she was living in one place in 2015, in the run-up to the 2015 election. Now evidence has emerged to show that she was living in a completely different place while telling the Electoral Commission and the Electoral Register, that she was living in one house, but photo evidence and her own words says her home was elsewhere. Surely she's got a duty to clear that up.
Well, I think Angela has answered questions and she's done it a lot.
I don't think she has. We're going to have to disagree on that one.
It's for ultimately these are Angela's questions to answer. But I also think, to be honest, in the grand scheme of the challenges in the country at the moment, I'm more worried about the fact that the number of people are waiting more than 24 hours a day is increased tenfold in the last 5 years.
And if Angela, if you're watching, you're more than welcome to sit where Wes is sitting and answer all these questions you say that you've answered. But back to the NHS. I'm just going to read you a couple of just emails we've got similar to feedback you've got. People are really angry. Steve says, who works in the NHS, we have 33,000 managers. If you want to make cutbacks, cut there. I'm not going to name the hospital he works in, but he told me, we're spending over 2 million a month over budget. We've got a load of directors and supervisors we never see, and the wards are short. It's an effing joke. The people that are making the cuts should spend a month on the front line and see how many members of staff they actually need. Would you agree with a scheme like that?
It's one of the reasons why I've spent quite a lot of time shadowing NHS staff in a whole range of different places. On the management front, we've always got to keep an eye on management costs and administration costs, and actually part of the reform that I want to drive is about improving the IT, the systems, the smart use of data, so you can strip out some of those management costs. If you think about the way in which the NHS has managed waiting lists, for example, that can change dramatically and far more efficiently. In fact, yesterday I was talking to the chief exec of Manchester Royal Infirmary and the trust in Manchester. People might say, but he's exactly one of those terrible managers we're talking about. He's also the chief executive who's driving system change, which is improving the efficiency of his waiting list. So I always be a bit careful about manager bashing. I don't want to tie everyone with the same brush, but we've definitely got to reduce the administration costs. And it's not lost on me that a lot of the people who do say, look, there's too much being spent in management and administration, are NHS staff working on the front line, and I think we need much more clinical leadership and more empowering of frontline clinical staff in hospitals.
Yusuf writes, and this is a good idea, I like this idea, I want to see what you think. Yusuf, again, who works in the NHS, if you want to get waiting lists down, why not tell NHS professionals who work overtime and want to bring the waiting list down as well, they will not get taxed on their overtime as an incentive to work longer hours? Great idea, right?
Oh, it's an interesting idea. I mean, we're definitely paying people under Labour's proposals to do those evening and weekend clinics that were proposed. In terms of changing the tax rules, look, that is a matter for Rachel Reeves, and I value my kneecaps. So I'm not going to announce a change to Labour's tax policy on your programme,
But you like
Harry,
the idea.
I'm sorry.
You like the idea.
Look, I definitely think that anything we can do to support not just the recruitment of NHS staff, but retention is important. And, you know, I'm thinking really carefully at the moment about what a Labour government will do to incentivise people to spend more time working in the NHS and to not leave the NHS, because that is one of the big risks at the moment, is people leaving the service.
We're going to come back. We're going to come back to the NHS with our own Sun Cabinet Health Secretary very shortly. But I'm going to ask you a couple of weirdo questions that came in. Right. Why does everyone on Twitter accuse you of burning down a pet shop?
I'm glad you asked this question, Harry.
Would you like to take this moment to tell the nation?
And look, I'm not often complimentary about my Twitter troll, but there was one troll a good few years back who mocked up this totally fabricated interaction between me and someone else on Facebook, where I was accused of burning down a pet shop at university to get into a university drinking society. And my favourite bit of that, this totally false story, completely made up, no truth in it whatsoever, is that someone said that my powerful and well-connected dad got me off. Now, my dad's a car salesman who lives in Romford. I don't think...
You predicted my next question here.
But the pet shop truthers are still out there. And look, I've got to hold my hands up. I did go and see the Pet Shop Boys a few years ago and did tweet a picture with 3 flaming emojis. So I may have fanned the flames of the conspiracy theory, but this is totally made up.
Cambridge University, management consultant, career politician, councillor, then MP.
I was a management consultant for 5 minutes because I was elected as a Labour councillor.
So career politician. Aren't you a middle-class lefty?
I'm a working-class turned middle-class lefty. And, you know, I'm not self-hating in that respect. I'm very proud to be on the centre-left, but I am not one of those middle-class lefties who cries betrayal just because Labour wants to reform and modernise our public services. I think, actually, the betrayal is the Labour Party hasn't got its act together over the last 4 general elections. We've lost 4 times. I think the country is paying the price, and that's why I'm very proud to work for Keir Starmer, who's grabbed the ball by the horns and changed the Labour Party in a way that many people thought impossible 4 years ago.
Isn't he a middle-class lefty as well, though?
Oh, yeah, but he's one of the good ones. I don't have to be consistent about this, Harry.
Wes, you're going to stay with us and we're joined by our Sun Health Secretary shortly. But thank you for that. Fascinating words, especially on the trans debate. Thank you. Now let's turn straight away to our Sun Cabinet's very own Dr. Pasha Makajay. Now, you've heard from our readers. Let's hear from the NHS experts. What did you think of Wes's interview there?
You sounded really passionate and... You know, I'm really looking forward to what you're going to do for the NHS. I love the word reform because I think most people are very scared of change, and I'm definitely not. I think the NHS 100% needs change. But how are you going to achieve it in 5 years if you do get the chance?
Yeah, so I don't think we can achieve everything in 5 years, but I think we can make a good start, and I think we can get performance standards like waiting times in A&E or response time for ambulances much closer, if not achieving the performance standards they should do after 1 term of Labour government. But I think what we're asking the country for really is a mandate for a decade of reform and modernisation. And in order to get permission for 2 terms, we need to make sure we deliver everything in the first. And that's why, although Labour sometimes gets criticism, like, are you promising enough? Are you going to be spending enough? I'd much rather come back in 4 or 5 years' time and have a conversation with you that says, you know what, we delivered our promises and we're able to do a bit more, than come back in 4 or 5 years' time and say, do you know what, we got a bit carried away, we're a bit too ambitious, and therefore I've got to explain to you why I broke the promises to you and to patients. So that's the balance we've tried to strike.
And I completely see that you, as a politician and someone who's had a positive, experience with the NHS, are wanting to change the NHS. But ultimately, you as a politician are not connected in any way to the health sector at all. So how do people, the public and the health sector, how can we trust someone who's completely disconnected with the actual health services, never spent a day in a ward, not had to face the criticism from patients, from social media, the censorship that we get, from GMC and all the rest of it. You don't know what it's like to be in the front lines. Why should we trust someone like you to make the decisions for where we work?
Well, I think first and foremost, I'm a patients champion, and patients are also an important voice in the system. But where I'd absolutely agree with you is that if we're going to get the NHS from where it is today, worst crisis in its history, to where we want it to be, ultimately that's not going to be driven by one politician sat behind one desk in Whitehall. It's got to be driven by the whole NHS team working together. And what we have to do in government is to make sure that we give you the tools to do the job, resources, sure, but also pushing as much power towards the front line as possible, making sure that where you've got clinicians coming up with brilliant ideas to improve patient care, that we've got your back, and also that we spread that, because any single one of Labour's policies on the NHS isn't something that I've cooked up. What I've done is look at best practice in the NHS, and the problem is it's outstanding practice, the exceptional practice. We've got to take the best of the NHS to the rest of the NHS, and that's the sort of the thrust of Labour's reform agenda.
Wes, isn't there a problem there, though? Look, you talk a good game, ministers talk a good game, you're pro-reform. There is a very vocal pro-reform part of the NHS, but there's also a very, very large part of the NHS that doesn't want to reform. It wants to keep on just going hand to mouth, essentially, because that's what they want to do. How are you going to convince a wider section of the NHS that your message is the right one?
Two things. One is I recognise that a lot of people are scarred by experience, and sometimes when I use the word reform, they instantly think top-down reorganisation, because that's what they remember. That was their last big reform, and they felt victims of it and devastated by it rather than empowered by it. So I've got to make an argument that says, look, this isn't top-down reorganisation. This is about the change, the modernisation that you as NHS staff are crying out for, and crucially patients are crying out for, because we're all in it for patients. And the other thing I'd say is, we shouldn't mistake the howls of online outrage as being representative of the NHS workforce.
It's unions as well, though, isn't it?
I do think sometimes there is a kind of default that says if we just had more money, everything would be better. And it's sometimes the job of politicians to trade in uncomfortable truths and to say, look, if we just go on as we are, we're not going to have the NHS as it is today in 10, 20, 30 years' time. We can't go on with managed decline. And what gives me hope, though, is that I see on the front line the sorts of reforms, the sorts of changes that we want to deliver. They are proving what's possible and actually giving not just the rest of the NHS, but our country, the hope and possibility that change is possible. Because at the moment, I don't think Labour's biggest opponent in the election is the Conservative Party. I think it's cynicism and people worrying about whether anyone can fix it.
Who's the face of that cynicism?
In terms of, I just think that millions of faces of that cynicism. I knock on doors all the time and talk to voters who will say, "I'm just
in the
not..."
public rather than within the NHS.
Oh, in terms of whether anyone can turn this around, yeah, I think that's where the public are at the moment. I think they can see the country's in a desperate state, but they are also absolutely done with politics and politicians, and that's a bad place for a country to be, because I genuinely think that we can't reform the NHS without the front line, without the staff, without the organisation pulling together. But we also can't do that without good politics. Yeah. And so Labour's got to try in the next, if we win the next general election, we've got to rebuild our public services, rebuild our economy, and rebuild trust in politics.
We've got the big picture. Dr. Pasha's got some very detailed questions about how you're actually going to do it. Everything from out-of-hours appointment, non-dom strikes.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Yeah, so, all I'm hearing is that, reform because what was done was wrong or bad. But we have just had the worst pandemic and so much has gone on. What would you have done differently, if at all? Because it's very easy to point the blame and point the finger at someone who's actually doing the job. And that sort of scrutiny is faced upon us as well, and we're doing the job. So, the Tories have been managing the country however they have been. What would you have been done differently?
So I think on the pandemic, we tried to work really constructively with the government because it was a national crisis. I do think there are lessons to be learned, but actually that wouldn't be where I'd focus my criticism on the last 14 years, and I would accept that if there'd been a Labour government, things would have been difficult. So that's not where I'd lay my criticism. Where I would lay my criticism was on that disastrous top-down reorganisation, and that actually, when you compare the NHS to health systems in other OECD countries, other advanced economies, we don't do nearly enough in primary care, community services, or general practice, community services, social care, mental health. And so part of Labour's reform agenda is to shift the centre of gravity of the NHS out of hospital into the community, making sure the NHS isn't just a national health service, but a neighbourhood health service. Because, because people can't get to see you as a GP, there are thousands fewer GPs, people are waiting far too long, they end up in A&E. And that's worse for them, but also more expensive for the taxpayer, because seeing a GP would cost about 40 quid, ending up in A&E costs 400. So you've got to constantly look at the system, how it's changing, how it's evolving and modernise.
And despite that, GPs only get 8% of the budget. Will the Labour government finally change that and put more money off the NHS pie, so to speak, into the
Yes,
GP?
I've been following what you've been saying, and I think you're right that as a percentage of the NHS's budget, we've got to grow primary care and general practice. Now, that'll be hopefully good news and music to the ears of GPs who I think want to spend more time with their patients, but there's reform as well. We measure you by about 40 different measurements in terms of the way in which we judge GPs. We've got to cut through some of that red tape so that you can spend more time in what we would call the family-doctor relationship, you would call continuity of care. The evidence tells us that's better for patients, but also it's what doctors enjoy doing and it's what patients value too. So that's the reform part.
The other elephant in the room, though, is the strikes. How would you possibly have dealt with it any differently without getting out a chequebook, which, by your own words, doesn't exist and Rachel Reeves won't let you?
Well, I think there's a few things. One is that I think the government were far too slow in recognising the risk to the NHS as a result of industrial action. We had this mad situation, do you remember? But when the nurses were threatening to go on strike, at the 11th hour, the Royal College of Nursing, which had never been on strike in its history, said to the government, look, if you just sit around the table with us, we'll postpone the strikes, we'll suspend the action. And the government said, no, we're not doing that. And they went off on strike. And once they went on strike, it was hard to get them back.
Yeah.
And then because they didn't have a strategy for pay overall, we've ended up in this, I think, pretty unconscionable position where consultants have had a better pay deal than nurses. Now, and I say this with respect to consultants, not least one of them saved my life a few years ago, and these are brilliant people. Consultants would understand when I say that I would not lie awake at night worrying about whether a consultant can pay their bills. But I do know plenty of nurses, plenty of porters, plenty of junior doctors who are struggling to pay the rent, who are struggling to pay the bills, and NHS hospitals are setting up food banks for their staff. That can't be right in 21st century Britain.
We're out of time with Dr. Pasha. One more question for the man that wants to lead the health service. One quick one.
Ultimately, you're talking about reforming the NHS, you're talking about reforming GP and primary care, but to do that, you have to retain the staff, and junior doctors definitely create the foundation of it. And we're still at the same position that we were at. Is there something, even if it's not monetary, is there some sort of advantage that we would have as junior doctors going forward that Labour can?
So what I'd say is we can't deliver 35% overnight. The route back to fair pay has got to be a journey, not an event, but I do recognise the case that junior doctors are making. And I also recognise that beyond pay, there are a whole number of other conditions in terms of the lack of respect for junior doctors, the way in which placements are undertaken. I think just the disrespect to the junior doctor cohort that we need to look at. And I want to work with junior doctors, and I just ask them to give me that time that we'll need as well.
Do you think the junior doctors' unions are slightly misrepresenting the views of the wider junior doctors? They seem to be much more militant.
Look, I think the BMA Junior Doctors Committee are definitely taking a hard line. You look at the percentage of people turning out in those ballots and the size of the mandate. I think what they are reflecting is a well of anger amongst junior doctors, and we've got to work with them because this is the future of the profession. It's not going to be easy.
If we believe the polls, it's going to be your problem in a number of months. Thank you for coming to see us.
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry you upset so many people with your article on Monday, but we enjoyed it.
There are going to be harder fights to have, and ultimately, unless we deliver the medicine it needs, the NHS isn't going to be there for us. And I appeal to Sun readers to give change a chance and give Labour a mandate at the election.
Dr. B, thank you. Wes, thank you. Readers, thank you for brilliant questions. Next, we move on to another equally tricky topic, Israel and Gaza. I'm Harry Cole. This is Never Mind The Ballots. Now, President Joe Biden says Israeli PM Netanyahu is making a mistake in Gaza, and he no longer supports the tactics of the IDF. He wants Israel to lay down arms just 6 months after they were laying down the bodies of 1,300 of their murdered citizens. Joining me now is Elon Levy, a man who was until very recently an Israeli government spokesman. Elon, welcome to Never Mind The Ballots.
Hello,
do you
Harry.
agree
Good
with
to
Joe
join you.
Biden?
No, Israel is going to continue going after Hamas, doing everything it can to bring back the hostages. We know that Hamas and Islamic Jihad are executing the hostages, starving them, torturing them, raping them, and we're not going to allow that to continue.
What do you think Joe Biden's playing at? Why has he changed his tack like this all of a sudden?
I don't think anyone expected this war to last quite as long as it has. Unfortunately, now we're entering well into the American presidential calendar. The war has become more than a distraction and nuisance. It's become a political problem for President Biden, who is now coming under increasing pressure from the left of his party. But President Biden knows that for him, the ultimate foreign policy victory will be for Israel to defeat and destroy Hamas and bring back the hostages. And if this war, which Hamas started, ends with that terrorist army still on its feet, threatening to repeat the atrocities of October 7th again and again, that'll be a shocking indictment of American policy in this war.
So you think Biden's playing to, the left of his party in a bid to secure his position or over the lives of, Israeli hostages?
I think for the United States and other countries as well, this war has become a problem that they would like to wish away. Unfortunately for us here in Israel, we don't have a magic wand or a magic bullet to make this problem go away, because Gaza isn't like when you were fighting against ISIS in Iraq thousands of miles away. It's literally our backyard. Gaza is meters away from people's homes. We still have 133 hostages there. We cannot afford to leave Hamas on its feet. And by the way, as Lord Cameron said just the other day in his column in the Times, no one can expect Israel to live alongside anymore next to Hamas while it threatens to perpetrate these atrocities again and again. He's hopeful there'll be some sort of diplomatic dialogue that will see Hamas dissolve itself. We don't think that's going to happen. And that's why it's important that Israel's allies back it to the hilt, so we make sure that Hamas can never do that again and we get those poor hostages back home.
Talking of Lord Cameron, and we'll get on to him a little later on as well on another matter, but he said in that same piece at the weekend that the world needs to seek peace in Gaza, even if Hamas will not sign up to a deal. And Joe Biden now saying unilaterally Israel must lay down arms for a matter of weeks and months. That's another word for that is surrender, right?
No, not at all. I read Lord Cameron's column. He said that he wants to see a temporary pause that will lead to a sustainable ceasefire. But then he asks a rhetorical question: what will happen if Hamas doesn't agree to a deal? And he then doesn't say that Israel's allies should force it to surrender. He says that the world needs an actionable plan to prepare for the continuation of this conflict, to take steps to alleviate the suffering of civilians in Gaza, make sure they're as protected as possible. But the solution isn't to throw Israel under a bus. The solution is to do everything possible to help civilians while standing by Israel's side.
Do you think...
And if the UK, the US, other countries want to see a deal that will let aid in and hostages out, the way to do that isn't to pressure Israel. The way to do that is to pressure Hamas. Because at the moment, Hamas thinks that the international community will eventually grow bored with Israel, tired with Israel, and do its work for it. And Hamas needs to know that until it releases those hostages and lays down its arms, Israel has a full right to go after the monsters who perpetrated the October 7th atrocities.
Is that how Biden's words have landed? Is that how it feels today where you are, that you're being thrown under a bus?
Increasingly, it seems that there is a crisis in relations between Israel and the United States. But President Biden has said Israel has every right to go after Hamas. He hasn't ruled out an operation in Rafah. He said he wants to see a plan that will enable civilians to be protected. And Israel is working on such a plan to help evacuate civilians, get them out of harm's way temporarily, so that we can destroy the last 4 Hamas battalions inside Gaza. As the Prime Minister here has been saying, you don't extinguish 3/4 of a fire. You extinguish the whole fire. And if you leave a quarter of Hamas's army standing in Rafah, that's a surefire recipe for the next round of conflict, because they'll just regroup, rearm, and refire.
Now, Elon, I can't help but notice you're now ex-Israeli government spokesman. What happened?
A story that has far more to do with domestic Israeli politics than the British press picked up. In Israel, it was widely reported in the middle of January that the Prime Minister's wife wanted me removed from my position. because I had been active in protesting against this government, against its judicial reform plans over the summer.
But you came to the flag in the wake of the atrocities on October the 7th and was one of the most
and I
vocal...
don't wish on any country the sort of crisis that saw Israeli civil society mobilize, come together, put political differences aside and fight together for what matters, destroying Hamas and bringing back the hostages. But as the Israeli media have been reporting, that was the context for some of the drama of recent months.
There's also a run-in with David Cameron, the aforementioned Lord Cameron as well, wasn't there, that you directly corrected, I think, something he said on Twitter from your own personal account. Was that not anything to do with it?
The Israeli media made a mountain out of a molehill and sensationalized something that was actually very innocuous. I had replied to Lord Cameron on Twitter about the question of humanitarian aid. I understand that someone in the Foreign Office sent a WhatsApp to someone in Israel asking whether my tweets criticizing the Foreign Secretary or replying to him were reflective of Israeli government policy. And as I said, the context of the drama in Israel is well known to everyone here.
So it wasn't Dave, it was domestic.
As the media here are reporting.
All right, while we're talking of WhatsApp, something's just breaking this morning I wanted to pick your brains on. There's reports today that if you have an iPhone and you download the new software update that Apple are offering, and then you type the word Jerusalem into a text message on WhatsApp or iMessage, you are recommended to use a Palestinian emoji. No other city has that flag connected to it. What do you think is going on there?
Clearly a bizarre glitch that I can only attribute to human error at Apple. Hopefully one that will be corrected in the next software update. Jerusalem is, of course, the capital city of Israel. It's where the Prime Minister's office is, the Knesset, the Foreign Ministry, the President's residence, the eternal historic capital city of the Jewish people dating back to King David. And I expect that will be corrected with the next update.
So you'd like to see Apple address this? You don't think there's someone perhaps making a political point buried deep in Apple there?
Oh, they may well be making a political point, but as I said, that too is a human error.
An error of fact rather than an error of judgment. But surely that's quite provocative for one of the world's biggest tech companies to be openly questioning whether Jerusalem is the capital of Israel.
Absolutely, and I would expect them to look into that and ask how that happened, especially if, as you say, no other cities get associated with flags in that way. But, you know, for us in Israel, it's been very clear what we are fighting against with Hamas since October 7th. Hamas didn't launch the October 7 atrocities because they wanted a two-state solution. Hamas launched the October 7th atrocities because they want to destroy the state of Israel. And as you see people chanting on the streets of London, they want from the river to the sea, which means eliminating the state of Israel. And a glitch like this on Apple that erases the capital city of Israel and wants to hand that over to the Palestinians is unfortunately part of this global wave of hostility that we're seeing against Israel.
Elon Levy, thank you very much. Lovely to chat as ever, and hope to see you soon again on Never Mind the Ballots. And now it's time for the weather, the political weather that is, with our very own Kate Ferguson.
Thanks, Harry. Hello and welcome everybody to the political weather, where each week I take the temperature of things in Westminster. After months of political storms, there's been an eerie calm in Westminster as MPs have all been off on their Easter holidays. But it's gloomy news for number 10 as I spy a triple whammy of dark clouds on the horizon. First off, dozens of Tory MPs are planning to rebel against number 10 and vote against Rishi's ban on smoking when it comes back to the chamber next week. One furious MP told me the ban is total illiberal nonsense, and they reckon around 70 Tories could defy number 10 and vote against it. Meanwhile, those Tory plotters trying to get rid of Rishi Sunak, well, they're back, and they're expected to launch a fresh assault on the PM next week. And finally, rumours are swirling that this guy, Chancellor Jeremy Hunt, is thinking of standing down at the next election. His team have denied the claim to me, but with the polls predicting he's going to lose his seat, is there a chance Hunt will bow out before he's forced? It seems it never rains, but it pours over at number 10 at the moment. Meanwhile, in Labour land, it's this woman, Angela Rayner, who's finding herself in the deep freeze. The Labour Party deputy leader is facing growing pressure over allegations she broke the law and dodged tax when she sold her council home in 2015. She's accused of registering her home in Stockport as her primary address, when in fact she lived at an entirely different property with her then husband. Angela has gone to ground and not given an interview in nearly 2 weeks now, and her colleagues are resorting to ever more bizarre excuses for her. David Lammy sparked outrage earlier this week when he suggested Angela should be able to dodge scrutiny because she's Northern and not in government. So Keir Starmer is standing by his deputy, for now at least. But with the police looking again at the case, Angela could end up getting frozen out if they decide she is guilty of wrongdoing. Things might be icy for many people in Westminster, but there is one Tory MP who is definitely feeling hot right now. And it's this guy, Robert Jenrick. The former immigration minister has had a glow-up. He stitched some of that weight he was carrying and he's got a new trendy Caesar haircut to match. Conservative MPs tell me that members of Jenrick's team are already quietly contacting them to sound them out for a possible support when the next Tory leadership race takes place, whenever that might be. So, is Robert's glow-up in fact a leadership makeover? And as it is general election year, we will of course check in on those all-important opinion polls. And you can see from the latest YouGov survey that Labour are well ahead at 43 points. The Tories are trailing on 20 and Reform are coming up on the outside at 16. Now, the thing about this poll, which is really worrying Tory MPs, is it puts Reform ahead of the Tories among Leave voters for the first time, by 35 points to 33 points. Summing up the doom and gloom on the Tory benches, one right-wing MP told me it's terrible, and if this guy, Nigel Farage, makes a comeback, I think we will get totally smashed. It's back to you, Harry.
Come join us. Though those polls, that Reform number is enough to scare, even the most moderate of Tory MPs. Do you really think they're going to poll at 16%, Kate?
It's weird, isn't it? Because they're polling really high at the moment, but they definitely underachieved in Rochdale.
Yeah.
So I think people will be looking at those local elections, that by-election. They're standing in Blackpool, aren't
yeah.
they? So, I think you'll be looking at, can they translate those high poll leads, or not leads, but high poll ratings into actual votes on the ground? They're yet to be tested. But what's definitely true is the fear factor with Farage, right?
Jack Elsom, Sun political correspondent, making your Never Mind The Ballots debut.
Thank you for having me.
Hello.
Hello.
You told me earlier you think Reform's a busted flush.
Well, I think that actually the challenge for them, the Blackpool by-election, is to translate their quite decent poll lead, let's be honest, into actual electoral reality. And at the moment, as Kate said, they haven't done that in the recent by-elections. Take Wellingborough, take Rochdale. They've said, we're going to do really well in this, and actually have flopped. And so I think Blackpool South is going to be their bread and butter, right? They should be winning by-elections. It's a free hit for their voters. It's the classic sort of seat they're going after. Working class, old Labour heartlands, Brexit territory. They need to do well in this to show they're going to be an electoral force.
Isn't the problem, though, that even if they don't poll anywhere near 16%, Kate, and they get, say, 8% at the general election, they're going to be the difference between lots of those marginal seats where the Reform vote will be slightly larger than the Labour vote that knocks the Tories out.
Yeah.
And that's where it could get devastating.
Yeah, really, the danger of Reform at this election isn't how many MPs they're going to get. They're probably not going to get any MPs. Sorry, Richard Tice, if you're listening.
He's a regular viewer, I hear. Yeah.
But the reality is that they're sucking away those Tory voters and they're causing the Tory parliamentary party to go a bit mad and have a kind of existential crisis. What are we about? Should Damien Green be in the same party as, Jonathan Gullis or Tom Hunt? They're kind of soul-searching at the moment. So Reform have already done a lot of damage, and it's to the Tories' self-confidence.
And that's even without Nigel Farage, as you say,
exactly,
coming back, which he's increasingly threatening to do. Jack, Andy Rayner, Wes Streeting looked pretty uncomfortable, I thought, earlier when I was asking about them. I don't think he deviated too far from the nothing to see here line, but it is becoming a problem for Labour that every time one of their spokesmen goes on television that they have to talk about the deputy leader.
Yeah, and it was the most uncomfortable he was that entire interview.
Apart from the trans apology, I think he was pretty uncomfortable there.
Well, yes, but he was actually quite, I think he was happy to talk about that a bit. Whereas the Angela Rayner stuff, try as they might, Labour, this is just not going away. And I think that it's actually moved on now from the original allegations of capital gains tax and electoral registration. It's actually moved on to the story they've told since then. And like you pointed out to Wes Streeting, Angela Rayner, straight off the bat when these claims surfaced last month, said, well, hang on a minute, I actually did live at this home. but there's been a catalogue of evidence since disputing that entire theory. Keir Starmer is standing by her, but bizarrely does not want to look at the tax advice, which she claims completely exonerates
Well,
her.
surely he doesn't want to look at it because he wants to know that if it does all go down the Swanee, he can then say nothing to do with me, Gov.
Well, that's what people
very
are thinking.
loyally approach.
That's what people are thinking. Their line is, oh, we trust her. But people are going to obviously say, you're trying to get some sort of like level of plausible deniability here if, as you say, things all go wrong. And so at the moment, they've got fundamental questions they need to answer. I think they need to publish this tax advice because, let's be honest, that's exactly what they would demand of Tory MPs.
Yeah. Kate, do you reckon she's in trouble yet?
Well, look, I think everyone in Labour are holding their breath and holding the line. And the line is basically, stand by Angie.
She's our friend, she's northern.
Well, but it's not
she's
just that, like,
the
the police are once again looking at it. So you stand by her until the police come back. If they say no case to answer, big collective sigh and they hope it all goes away. But obviously, I think there's been a bunch of damage done to her reputation because her political reputation is all about being authentic. And this has kind of muddied that a little bit, really.
Final thought. Local elections coming up, May 2nd. Tories and MPs are back in Parliament next week. Do the Tory MPs make a move before or after the local elections? What do you reckon?
I can't see it. I just don't think they're going to be changing for a fourth leader in 5 years.
It'll be very on brand to have a vote of confidence the week of the local elections.
It would be, but I don't think, unlike previous leadership elections, I just don't think there's anyone waiting in the wings. There's no king over the water who actually could do it or wants to do it, so I'm not sure.
I think the locals are probably going to be bad. I think you're going to see people stick their head above the parapet. Do you get to those, 50 letters? I doubt it. But will you see knives out for Rishi Post locals? I imagine so.
Guys, let's go and write the paper. Thank you very much. Look, thank you to my guests this week, Jack and Kate, and of course Elon Levy, Dr. Pasha Makajay, and of course Wes Streeting. And thank you to our readers once again for brilliant questions. Join us next week, where we'll be joined by a Tory leadership contender. I can't think of who that might be, but he's got a new haircut. And we'll also be joined by someone who was very briefly Tory leader, former Prime Minister Liz Truss. Have a good week, and never mind the ballots.